Even men at the top of their game find themselves wanting more from life. Whether it's more meaning, unshakable confidence, a bigger impact, more money, deeper love, a hotter sex life, or a powerful legacy. Find out how good your life can be on this episode of Man Alive. Also, as I've supported men in their love and work lives for 15 years now, many men ask for the right words to say to be more successful, attractive, and desirable. But I found it's not so simple as giving scripts or lines because every man is different. So giving words or scripts would be like giving a tall, thin man a shorter, wider man's pants, or vice versa. The words have to make sense for you and your personality, and there's so much happening beneath the surface that people are responding to. If you're interested in how to become a better lover and leader in your own unique way, go to shanajamescoaching.com/quiz, or you can text ALIVE to 44144. It only takes a couple minutes and you'll start to get an idea of how you can be both more respected and desired. After you fill it out, we can schedule a time to review your quiz and talk about your specific challenges and desires. So again, go to either shanajamescoaching.com/quiz or text ALIVE to 44144. That's ALIVE to 44144. Enjoy this episode of Man Alive. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Man Alive. I'm your host, Shana James, and I'm excited to talk today about your pleasure and the collective fear, as you're going to hear about, that men's collective fear of pleasure. And I'm a huge fan of men having, more love, more pleasure, more of all the good things, receiving more. And so I'm excited today to have a guest, Cam Fraser, to talk about this. And Cam is a sexologist and a sex coach in Australia. And we're so happy to have you here today. Welcome.
Hey, Shana, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. So maybe give us a moment of, how did you actually get into this? Were there personal struggles, or how did you find your way into the sex coaching world?
Yeah, I feel like most people in the sexuality profession come into it for personal reasons.
Yeah.
That's my observation, at least anyway.
Yep.
So yeah, I did have a journey around my own sexuality, overcoming my own issues, ranging from premature ejaculation and erectile dysfunction to a pretty shitty porn viewing habit,
Yeah.
a lot of disconnected sex. Lots of the saying that I usually use to sum up like the sex that I was having was quantity over quality, and that was during my like teenage years and my college years.
Yep.
I was using a lot of alcohol as well as I was abusing alcohol, that's for sure, and that manifested as alcohol induced impotence and just a lot of like really poor mental health related to all that. A lot of anxiety and insecurity about my masculinity and about my sexual performance. And so, long story short, I suppose, that all came to a head
Yeah.
with some, like I said, pretty poor mental health stuff, and prompted me to go and see a counselor. And the counselor was the school counselor, and she very correctly put me on to a therapist, and we did some narrative therapy together. So for those that are unfamiliar, narrative therapy is essentially looking at all those stories that you tell yourself about who you are and how you exist in the world, and discerning whether or not these stories are beneficial to you and whether or not they're serving you.
Mm.
And then once you find out the ones that aren't serving you, you work on rewriting those stories so that they better help
Powerful.
you exist in the world, I suppose. And so what I really did was look at all these stories that I told myself about what it means to be a man and
Yeah.
where I got those stories from: religion, my family, the media, my mates, the women in my life, all these other places, my own internalized stories, and decided like, well, these aren't actually helping me. I don't feel healthy. I don't feel safe in my own body. There was a lot of things that were coming up for me, right? There's a lot of insecurity. And so through the course of like probably 2 years of narrative therapy with this lovely therapist, kind of came to a point in my life where I, in the most compassionate way possible, stopped giving a shit about what other people thought about me, and started showing up in the way that felt like really good and genuine and authentic for me as a man. And by extension of that, as a sexual man as well. What does it mean for me to be a man and express my sexuality? And so that was like a really big personal transformation for me. And I was studying psychology at the time at university. So I was kind of like interested academically in psychology and working with people in that capacity. And also I was going through my own personal journey around like my masculinity and sexuality. And also I should add, I was doing a lot of like physical practices as well, because I had a serious back injury. I actually fractured my lower spine. Wow. As part of my rehabilitation, I was introduced to yoga, Pilates, massage. Through those modalities, I was then introduced to like breath work and tantra and some other like really beautiful modalities. And so not only was I doing like the cognitive psychological work, I was also doing a lot of like the physical work as well, the somatic work. Yeah. And so I like learned how to breathe properly, learned how to release tension from my body. So I had a very rapid transformation doing all this work at the same time. Wow. And I noticed that like my relationships with men changed, my relationships with women changed, my relationship with myself changed for the better. And I started having much more confidence, sexually speaking, right? I wasn't drinking as much. So I was like much more in tune and aware of the sensations in my body. I was breathing much more, deeply and effectively. So I was able to like be a bit more in control of my sexual arousal and not peak out so early.
Such a powerful story, and like all the what's it, not the combinations, like the confluence, right, of who you think of yourself as a man, and how that bleeds into or is really the foundation of your relationship life, your sex life, I'm sure your career and success also, but such a powerful journey you had in such a short amount of time to really get to dive into, okay, how am I thinking of myself? And then how am I actually living, acting, choosing?
Yeah, very much so. And like, if I speak like into the psychological change, I suppose, like I felt much more secure in who I was as a man sexually. And so I felt much more comfortable talking to my partners about sex rather than running this old script of like, I'm the man, I have to be the assertive, dominant, knowledgeable partner who like doesn't ask what my partner's into because I just intuitively know, because that's what men are supposed to do.
Right, because you're supposed to know. You're not supposed to ask these questions.
Yeah, exactly, right. I was like, well, fuck that off, because that's not been helpful at all for me, and it hasn't been conducive for good sex. I've been really anxious this whole time. Yeah. And it hasn't been pleasurable at all. So I was like, why don't I just start asking my partner what they're into? What do they like? Start talking about what I desire. Start asking these questions and being more communicative in sex, and throwing my ego out of the bedroom and be like, I don't know everything. Tell me about your body. What do you like? Let's play. Let's explore. So I felt much more comfortable and confident holding that type of energy when it came to sexual experiences, rather than just like drinking and trying to get my courage up and then trying to like be the person who's in charge because that's what was expected of me, and just going through those motions and running that old script. So that's how it changed for me.
I love your living example of throwing the ego out of the bedroom. And so many men I work with, have that idea. Oh, I'm not supposed to ask because I'm already supposed to know. And I'm like, no, I think that's the biggest key secret, whatever you want to call it, right? Is how much asking can shift that sense of awkwardness and nervousness and, self-doubt. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. It's like, oh, because we're not talking about it. And then there's no way to know, really. I mean, unless you're very attuned and in your body like you became, but most men who aren't talking about it haven't gone through that transformation yet either.
Yeah. And it was a like personal journey that really informed my decision to go into this work, right? Like that was, to bring it back to that initial question, my personal transformation, I was like, wow, this has changed the way that I interact with the world around me. Yeah. I want to help men do that, right? Awesome. And that was that kind of like light bulb moment for me. And I suppose, part of that was, and you mentioned this right at the beginning when you introduced me, part of that was like confronting my resistance to really exploring pleasure. I had this like really strong belief, and I noticed this with a lot of men, that like male sexuality is simple, not very complicated, very straightforward, very linear, not very pleasurable, just kind of like it's gratifying, right? It's like a bit of sexual gratification. There's just 5 second sticky white crotch sneeze, and that's kind of it. But women's experiences of sexuality as like, complicated, and the mood's got to be right, and it's, circular, and like it's got to have all these things, and it's multi-orgasmic, and like women are writhing in pleasure. And you see this like epitomized in pornography, for example, right? I use that as like a very stereotypical example of like the guy's just like grunting and then he comes, but the women are there like, writhing in ecstasy, probably fake ecstasy, right? It's all performance. But like that very much epitomizes the way that a lot of men especially think about male sexuality versus female sexuality. And I've also found that that's reflected in academia as well, the way that we study male sexuality versus the way that we study female sexuality. I like to take the models of sexual arousal as an example of this, like from the 1960s. So I think 1966, Masters and Johnson put those two models of sexual arousal or sexual response out. And the male model of sexual response for like 60 years went unchallenged. It was just like arousal, plateau, orgasm, resolution. That was it. And people were like, yeah, that sounds pretty good for men. That sounds right. The women's model was revised like 9 or 10 times. The feminists had a crack at it. Like the sex positivity crew had a crack at it. Yeah. And they really like went into this model and were like, well, that's not true. And like, there's all these like complexities, and there's like, because there is, right? Because human sexual response is complex. And only in the last like 5 or 10 years have I really seen, probably even just only the last 5 years, have I seen people start to revise the male model academically and be like, well, actually, there's way more diversity with regards to men's sexual responses.
That's so interesting because, oftentimes men are studied as the foundation of health and body and everything. And so I would have thought, okay, well, men would have revised that and really put a lot of time and energy into it. But I can also see that because women aren't often as studied, that, certain women come in and they're like, hey, this is not right. This is not what's real. So I love that there's now more starting, at least, to expand what male sexuality looks like or, feels like. So can you talk a little bit more about that collective fear of pleasure, and, where does that come from? What does it feel like? Like, how would a man know if he's stuck inside of that collective fear?
Sure. Well, I'll share, I guess, from my own personal experience. Hopefully that resonates with some of the men listening. Initially I was following that script really rigidly. So my masturbation habits were like I was very much going through the motions. It was like sitting in front of a computer screen, just like mouse in one hand, cock in the other, just like jerking off and not really exploring my body too much, right? There was not a lot really of fear around exploring my body. Yeah, exactly. It was like, I've got a job to do and I like need to get to this ejaculation, and then that's kind of it, kind of wipe up, get on with the rest of the day. So it was very what's the word, like utilitarian, you know what I mean? Like it was like, this is the purpose of this, is to get to this goal, and then that's it, right? And if I for some reason couldn't get to that goal, then I felt like I'd failed, right? Or I felt like something was wrong with me. That was especially true in sex. If I didn't get an erection, if I didn't penetrate, if I didn't get to ejaculation, my first thought was, I've got a dysfunction, I'm broken, right? I need to be fixed. So that's like the way that oftentimes male sexuality is framed for a lot of guys. It's very function oriented, right? And it's not very pleasure oriented. It's like performance oriented, not pleasure oriented. And so that translates into the way that they approach their masturbation and the way they approach sex. It's, like I said, very performance oriented. It's like, I've got to get an erection, I've got to penetrate, I've got to ejaculate, I've got to last a certain amount of time, I've got to have this size penis. And all of that detracts from their experience of actual pleasure. Right. And so like, that's one way of thinking about it. But another way of thinking about it as well, if I again reflect on my own experience, was like, if I was to explore my body, if I was to like touch my body and maybe not focus so exclusively on my genitals, if I was to like explore the pleasure in my nipples or my face, or like, God forbid, explore it in my ass and my prostate as well, like the story that would come up for me back then would be like, I'm weird, or more specifically, I'm gay, right? If I like really lean into my pleasure and my sensuality and my eroticism, which in our society is very much coded as a feminine thing to do, like it's closely coded pleasure with femininity, in my observation, that is also linked in that very heteronormative way to like gay men as well. Like, to, femininity and homosexuality is very much, linked in our society as well, even though that's not necessarily the case. It's just how it's coded. So my internalized homophobia was like, God, if I do that, if I do anything other than just going through the motions, watching porn like a normal guy, then I'm going to be weird. Or what if my mates found out that I was doing this? Or like I was like, it was just a very anxious, fearful experience that I was having. And I see that time and time again with men. And I think there's this like really collective disconnection from pleasure, or this collective fear of pleasure for men, because it is coded as a feminine thing. And in our society that we live in, anything that's not masculine is like denigrated and is seen as lesser than, and is something that you need to avoid in order to maintain your masculinity, right? In order to like make sure your man card doesn't get revoked. So
I often see that too in a man trying to, in a heterosexual relationship, trying to make a woman feel good and trying to pleasure her so he can be good, but then leaving his own body and pleasure out, right? Instead of like, oh, I'm going to feel the pleasure of the both of us, or I'm going to feel my own pleasure as I'm pleasuring her. It becomes a job, like you're saying, and there's more of that function versus enjoyment.
Yeah, I've said this before, and people have like misunderstood this. So I'll try and be clear. But I think that men prioritize women's pleasure over their own. And the blowback that I've received when I've said that is, what about the orgasm gap? And it's like, yes, I agree. Like that's a real thing. But the caveat that I have to that statement is, men prioritize women's perceived pleasure over their own sexual gratification. So I'm making a distinction there between pleasure and gratification. I think men are really good at sexual gratification for themselves, not very good at like full-bodied
pleasure,
ecstatic, pleasurable experiences
because I
for
could
themselves.
See that sometimes men prioritize their sexual gratification over a woman's orgasm. But you're right. It's a whole complex web of things. And gratification
and
over pleasure.
Speaking to what you shared as well, like a lot of women fake their pleasure when they're with their partners. And one of the reasons why is because guys treat their partner's pleasure as their responsibility, as their job, right? Like I've got to do the things to make my partner have an orgasm. And the framing there is like, her orgasm is like my responsibility, and the responsibility is from like a place of egoic responsibility, right? Like it makes me feel more of a man if I give my partner orgasm, because I'm the person that's doing it, not like the proper framing, in my opinion, which is, well, it's her orgasm. I'm just there helping her facilitate that. I'm there doing the things that she's asking so I can help her have that orgasm, right? I'm a part of her experience, not I'm the one doing it to her. That's the shift there. And so one of the reasons why a lot of women fake orgasms, at least in my observation, is because of men's ego, right? And they don't, like, a lot of women care about their male partners. They go, well, I don't want him to feel like he's shit in bed. I don't want to hurt his feelings, right? Like I want to make sure that he thinks like he's doing a good job. And a lot of guys take it very personally if their partner speaks up and says, well, actually, that's not really doing it for me. And they'll recoil, right? And they'll retreat and withdraw and not be sexual, right? Because a lot of guys will feel hurt by that because their ego is very much wrapped up in their sexual prowess or their sexual performance. So a lot of women don't speak up. And there's other reasons why. There's a lot of conditioning around it as well, but it doesn't lead to, it's not conducive for really mutually pleasurable sex.
No, I was going to say it doesn't lead to we've got setting more up. Pleasure for anyone, or more intimacy or connection or any of that.
Yeah, I think one of the other reasons as well that I'll share, like that I think men have this fear of pleasure, is because of early ejaculation, right? Like being in your pleasure and being really like erotic and like feeling that in your body is like unfamiliar territory for a lot of guys, right? And so to be in there, even very briefly, can lead very quickly to an ejaculation. And so, and again, we've coded like ejaculation as being the end,
the goal,
sexual encounter, right? It's the goal and it's the end as well. I often ask, like, what happens after an ejaculation? And a lot of couples go, well, nothing, right? He rolls over, has a cigarette, and goes to sleep, right? That's the very stereotypical Hollywood example. So, like, ejaculation is seen as this thing to avoid, but it's also the goal, right?
Yeah.
So it's like a weird relationship with ejaculation. And so being in pleasure can actually lead to a quicker ejaculation
Right.
because a lot of
If you
guys
haven't
are
learned, right, as you started to do, how to actually
exactly, yeah. If
stay
you're
in
not
your body
expanding
to
your
make it last.
capacity to
And,
hold that pleasure
right.
in your body, then yeah,
Yeah.
it can definitely be an uncomfortable experience. And so what I encourage guys to do is like spend more time in that, right? Spend more time in that heightened state of arousal, in that experience of heightened pleasure, so that you become more
Allow your
familiar with
body
it,
to
so it
become more
becomes
familiar.
yeah less uncomfortable. So I think yeah, there's a discomfort being in that space for a lot of guys, and also because like when you're in that space, you might look a certain way, right?
Right. There's
You might
less
make a face,
control,
right?
right? Yeah.
Totally, yeah, and that's a very masculine, masculinity coded thing, right? It's like being in
Right.
control is to be the person who's like got the assertive, dominant kind
Right.
of
I
in
mean,
control nature.
all
So
shit can break loose, right? Like you can start having all kinds of experiences and emotions, and it's
making
very much,
noise, all that stuff can come through. And I think like part of that is like to be in that ecstatic, orgasmic, blissful state of pleasure, you have to let go,
right.
right? You kind of have to, and the word that comes to mind here is surrender to the
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
And again, that's coded as something that's like
Not
weakness
masculine.
and
Yeah.
not masculine and vulnerable and all that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. So
I did
I
an
think like,
episode, by the way, just for you listening, on
yeah,
surrender for men, especially. So go back and look for that one.
very
Because
cool.
right, I agree. It's such a powerful state, surrender, and yet it isn't coded as masculine. And so it can be one of those where, there's that conflict again and not, able to let go into that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like, and maybe this is more general, not necessarily just specifically to men, but like there's a pleasure negativity and sex negativity in our society, and
Yeah.
the uh, the meme that comes to mind is
Yeah.
the scene from Mean Girls where Coach Carr talks about not having sex because you'll get pregnant and you'll die,
Oh my
and
God.
what is so funny to me is that was supposed to be a satire of the American sex education system, but
Yeah.
it ended up being a
It's
pretty
real.
pretty accurate
God, that was
representation of
horrible.
it, which is fantastic. But I do think that is quite true, generally speaking, in
Yeah.
our population, right? It's like people have this anxious, fear-oriented approach to sex because that was the lack of sex education that we got, or that was like the fear-oriented sex education that we got, which is like, you could get an STI and you could ruin your life, and God forbid you get pregnant, and now there's some very real fear as well, especially if it's pregnancy related and even sexual health related. Like accessing healthcare is difficult in some countries, and protections for women's reproductive rights has been rolled back in some countries as well. So it's like a very visceral, real fear for many people. So I think that also lends itself to pleasure negativity and the fear of pleasure itself. So I think all of that wrapped up into like these different layers and this amalgamation is what lends itself to men having a lot of fear around it.
Yeah, and we weren't taught to like how to consciously parse that out. It's more just like the black or white. Okay, so let's try to instill the fear. Okay, so what's your solution like for the men you work with who are stuck in that collective, fear of pleasure? How do you support them to move through that?
I do a little bit of narrative therapy with them myself, but more so my approach is very practical. So I encourage them and I guide them to cultivate what I'll call a self-pleasure practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I use the term self-pleasure there very deliberately, as opposed to masturbation, for example, because masturbation has a lot of baggage to it. It's got a lot of connotations, right? And oftentimes if I say the word masturbation in the context of talking about men, an image that gets conjured up is like what I shared before, sitting in front of a computer screen, jerking off, going through the motions, or maybe on your phone, swiping, again, going through the motions. So I want to reframe here from masturbation to self-pleasure, because self-pleasure, as the name suggests, is anything that you yourself find pleasurable. It doesn't have to include genital stimulation. It doesn't have to include pornography. It's an invitation to explore what you find pleasurable. And so within that practical context is an evaluation of that man's relationship with pleasure, and full spectrum pleasure here as well, not just the sexually explicit pleasure, but the pleasure that you get from drinking a cup of tea, right? Or the
Got it.
pleasure that you get from being out in nature and noticing the feeling of the earth on your feet, right? Or the
Love
pleasure
that.
that you get from eating your favorite food, right? Or the pleasure that you get from simply doing a little touch-based practice. There's a really fantastic practice
Oh,
from
that's
Betty
so
Martin
great.
called "Wake Up
Oh,
Your Hands."
yeah, I love
So
her.
there's a whole not system, I suppose, but there's a whole uh, exploration
Yeah.
of pleasure that I encourage men to do, and
Great.
it's solo to begin with, right? Because it's
Yeah.
like connecting in with their body, building an awareness of sensations with their
Yeah, it's
body.
harder to do that when you're with someone else and you're used to trying
Very
to
much so.
take responsibility or take care of that person.
Yeah. And so once they've kind of like gone on a bit of a journey with their own pleasure, their own relationship with pleasure, their relationship with their body,
Yeah.
their stories that they tell themselves about what it means to be a man, part of that might include doing some, touching of the rest of their body, including, like I said before, like nipples, face, ass, prostate, things like that, working on internalized homophobia, just rewriting those stories somatically for themselves.
Yeah.
Then we start to do things with, if they've got a partner, with their partner. And so one of the things that I've noticed is women have the same stories about male sexuality that men have. And so there's like a partnered educational piece that has to come in with this,
Right.
because
Otherwise, there's kind of a
when
collusion in there.
totally, yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I help my male clients communicate and educate their female partners about the nuances and complexities of male sexuality.
Awesome.
And it's helpful if he's already had that physical experience, right? He can actually speak from his own lived experience of like,
Yeah.
hey, I had this like really pleasurable experience that didn't involve an ejaculation.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's a very common one that comes up for women in kind of heterosexual relationships. Is ejaculation is kind of this signifier of of men's experience of pleasure,
Totally.
right? Like
Right.
that's how
Kind of
it's been
similar the
conflated.
other way, as you were talking about before, that men feel good when they can make a woman orgasm. I think, right, women have that same, oh, I'm not good
100%.
enough, or I'm not attractive enough somehow if he's not having an ejaculation, right? Versus an orgasm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are very much on the money there. That's a story that can pop up is self-worth, right?
Yeah.
Around not being attractive enough, or not being sexy enough for him, or him not being aroused by her, and things like that. So there's a conversation that needs to happen there around her stories of male sexuality, and that's what I help men do as well, is like communicate to their partner, in a more pleasure positive way.
Great. I love it. Well, this is fantastic. And this is, a dip into all of the work that you do. And I know we could go much deeper, but for time's sake, is there anything you feel like we're missing, on this level, or any important thing that you want men to know before we complete?
The only thing that I want to end with is curiosity, right? Like that was the thing that really prompted me to start exploring my own sexuality and going on this journey. And it's the common denominator that I find in my male clients who see success with their sexual journey is they're curious to learn more about their body. They're curious to learn more about their partner's body. They're curious about like, asking questions about what it means to be a man. They're curious about, the history or like the evidence around certain experiences. And so, and not only is that really good for like starting your journey, but it's also what's going to maintain that thriving sex life for the rest of your life, is being curious about how your body changes as you age, being curious about new novel experiences, being curious about revisiting old experiences. There's all this stuff that's available to you if you're able to lean into that playful, curious, experimental, exploratory nature.
Yes, I 100% agree with you, right? That sense of like, instead of more of a rigid mindset, or I'm supposed to know, or there are these ways that we're supposed to be, or expectations, right? To really lean into that curiosity of who are you and who am I, and what about this moment and the next moment and the next moment, because we're always changing, and our bodies are changing as we age, and our hearts are changing. Everything's changing, right? Consistently. And so I agree that also creates more of that, the sustainable future, instead of the fading, the fizzling, the becoming roommates with each other in long-term relationships.
Amazing. I'm glad that resonates with you. That's cool.
Yeah, totally. Okay. What would you say, like, what would a first step be for a man? I know the self-pleasuring practice, but if a man's just, getting off listening, we'll tell him where he can find more of you. Is there anything he can do in this moment right away to start this process?
Yeah, the two things that I would recommend is starting to explore your body a bit more when you're masturbating. It doesn't have to be, I've got to start a self-pleasure practice tonight, but just like be a
Right.
little bit more
First step.
curious and
Yeah. Be
exploratory
more
with your
curious.
body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Start to explore a part of your body that you haven't before, right? When
Awesome.
you're masturbating. That's one step on the practical, physical side of things. The other thing would be take a bit of an inventory of your relationship with pleasure, right?
Yeah.
So maybe write down all the things that are pleasurable to you. And you can start off very explicitly sexual and then start to get a little bit more general, right? A bit more abstract. What is it that's enjoyable to you, that brings you pleasure, that doesn't involve, sexual stimulation? So take a bit of a stock take of your relationship with pleasure.
Love it. And I could also see really starting to get curious, like, what am I not supposed to feel pleasure doing, right? Like, hey, these are the things, or noticing as you look at that list of what you do find pleasure in, the themes or what's actually left out of that list, to start to get a sense of, oh yeah, like, well, why don't I experience pleasure in these certain moments? And, what stories do I have? Like you said, what are the narratives I have about who I'm supposed to be that would have me not experience pleasure here?
Totally. I mean, the intention with like those practices is to intentionally bring up those stories, right? Like
Yes.
mindfully bring them up so that you can start to challenge them, or if they really work for you, so you can reaffirm it, right? So that's the intention behind those.
That's so great too, right? That we have all these ideas and stories in our head, and if they work, great, reaffirm them. And if they don't, then okay, let's create some new stories and some new ahas of how those don't actually have to run your life or create who you are.
Yep. Yep. Totally.
Awesome. Awesome. That's so great. So where can our listeners find more of you?
You can find me on social media. I'm at the Cam Fraser on all social media platforms, or you can jump onto my website, which is cam-fraser.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today and for showing men, the more that's possible, and not only the more pleasure that's possible, but the releasing of shame and self-doubt and, all of the things that cause pain and suffering all the way, to depression, anxiety, suicide. So thank you for being a force of good in this way.
Oh, that's so lovely, Shana. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode of Man Alive. I hope you enjoyed our conversation and it gave you something to consider and explore in your life. If you like what you heard, I'd be so grateful for you to subscribe and write a quick review that helps men like you find us. And again, head over to shanajamescoaching.com/quiz or text the word ALIVE, ALIVE, to 44144 to get a sense of how you can become a better lover and leader. You'll start to see how you can be both more respected and desired in your unique and genuine way. If you don't feel as confident or as excited about life or love as you'd like to be, this quiz is a really great starting point and will guide you toward a more passionate love life and a more inspiring and successful career. So again, text ALIVE, ALIVE, to 44144 or head over to shanajamescoaching.com/quiz. Join us each week for a new episode of Man Alive.